In Russian historiography, World War I does not occupy the same place as the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945 or the Patriotic War of 1812. Even though the imperial government tried to call that conflict the Great Patriotic War, the term never caught on. If the wars of 1812 and 1941 to 1945 were clearly seen as national wars of liberation, then for most people in Russia, the aims and objectives of the conflict that began in 1914 felt distant and difficult to grasp. And the longer the First World War went on, the less desire there was to fight for the abstract goal of taking the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Today's attempts at the highest levels to rewrite history by assigning greater significance to Russia's role in World War I distort historical reality no less than inventing new national holidays that have no real tradition behind them. Regardless of how one feels about the war's aims and objectives in 1914 to 1918, one cannot deny that it left behind many examples of the courage and resilience of Russian soldiers. One such example was the attack of the dead during the defense of Osovets Fortress on August 6, 1915. It was the second year of the war, and the situation on the Eastern Front was not going Russia's way. On May 1, 1915, after a gas attack near Gorlice, the Germans managed to break through Russian lines, launching a massive offensive by German and Austrian forces. As a result, the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, Galicia, and parts of Latvia and Belarus were lost. The Imperial Russian Army alone lost 1.5 million prisoners, and total losses in 1915 reached around 3 million killed, wounded, or captured. Was the Great Retreat of 1915 simply a disgraceful flight? No. Regarding that same breakthrough at Gorlice, the noted military historian Anton Krasnovsky wrote, "At dawn on April 19th, the 4th Austro-Hungarian and the 11th German armies struck the 9th and 10th Corps at the Dunajec and near Gorlice. 1,000 guns, up to and including 12-inch caliber, flooded our shallow trenches with a sea of fire across a 35-verst front. Then the massed infantry of August Mackensen and Archduke Joseph Ferdinand rushed in to storm them. Each of our corps was facing an enemy army. Each of our brigades faced a corps, and each of our regiments faced an entire division. Emboldened by the silence of our artillery, the enemy believed our forces had been wiped from the face of the earth. But from those devastated trenches rose small groups of men half buried in the earth, the remnants of the bloodied but unbroken regiments of the 42nd, 31st, 61st, and 9th Divisions. It was as if the Zorndorf Fusiliers had climbed from their graves. With their iron resolve, they absorbed the blow and averted the collapse of the entire Russian armed force. The Russian army retreated because it was suffering from a severe shortage of shells and rifles. Russian industrialists who in 1914 loudly demanded take the Dardanelles and insisted on being given political power to secure a victorious end to the war, proved unable to deal with the chronic lack of weapons and ammunition. Wherever the Germans concentrated their breakthroughs, they stockpiled up to 1 million shells. For every 100 German artillery rounds, Russian artillery could answer with only 10. The plan to equip the Russian army with sufficient artillery fell apart. Instead of the planned 1,500 guns, it received only 88. Poorly armed and technically less trained compared to the Germans, the Russian soldier did what he could, paying in personal bravery and blood for the miscalculations of his commanders and for the laziness and profiteering of those working behind the lines. Even short on shells and bullets, as they retreated, Russian troops dealt heavy blows to the German and Austrian forces, which suffered combined losses of some 1.2 million people in 1915. A notable page in the history of this 1915 retreat was the defense of Osovets Fortress, located only 23 kilometers from the border with East Prussia. According to one of the fortress's defenders, Sergei Khmelkov, Osovets' main task was to block the enemy's nearest and most convenient route to Białystok, forcing the Germans either to lose time laying a lengthy siege or to seek roundabout ways. And Białystok was effectively the road to Vilna, Vilnius, Grodno, Minsk, and Brest, Russia's gateway. The first German attacks came as early as September 1914, and from February 1915, methodical assaults were launched. They were repelled for 190 days, despite the Germans' enormous technical advantage. They brought in the famous Big Berthas, 420 mm German mortars, and with them 800-kilogram shells capable of piercing 2-meter-thick steel and concrete ceilings. A single shell left a crater 5 meters deep and 15 meters across. Around Osovets, the Germans deployed 4 Big Berthas and 64 other large siege guns, 17 batteries in total. The most terrifying bombardment happened at the beginning of the siege. On February 25th, the enemy opened fire on the fortress, intensified it to a hurricane barrage on the 27th and 28th, and continued to pound the fortress until March 3rd, recalled Khmelkov. By his calculations, over that horrific week alone, the fortress was hit by 200,000 to 250,000 heavy shells, and by the end of the siege, up to 400,000 had been fired in total. The fortress looked dreadful, he remembered. It was shrouded in smoke through which massive bursts of flame erupted here and there from exploding shells. Columns of earth, water, and even entire trees were thrown into the air. The ground shook, and it seemed impossible for anything to survive that storm of fire. It seemed no one could come out of that hurricane of iron and fire alive, Khmelkov wrote. Yet the fortress held. The defenders were asked to hold out for at least 48 hours. They held on for 190 days, knocking out 2 Big Berthas in the process. It was especially crucial to keep Osovets during the Great Retreat so that Mackensen's legions couldn't trap the Russian army in the Polish sack. Seeing that their artillery wasn't achieving the desired result, the Germans began preparing a gas attack. We should note that poison gas had previously been banned by the Hague Convention, which the Germans cynically ignored, just as they ignored many other restrictions, under the slogan Germany above all. A sense of national and racial supremacy paved the way for the inhumane methods of the First and Second World Wars. Germany's World War I gas attacks were the precursor to the gas chambers of the future. The figure at the center of German chemical warfare was Fritz Haber. He enjoyed watching, from a safe vantage point, the suffering of enemy soldiers poisoned by his gases. It is telling that his wife took her own life after the German gas attack at Ypres. The first gas attack on the Russian front, conducted in the winter of 1915, failed because of the low temperatures. Later on, especially in warm weather, gases, chiefly chlorine, became reliable allies of the Germans, including at Osovets in August 1915. The Germans prepared for the gas attack meticulously, waiting for the right wind. They set up 30 gas batteries and thousands of cylinders. At 4 in the morning on August 6th, a dark green cloud of chlorine and bromine rolled toward the Russian positions, reaching them within 5 to 10 minutes. The gas wave, 12 to 15 meters high and 8 kilometers wide, penetrated up to 20 kilometers deep. The fortress defenders had no gas masks. Everything living in the open near the fortress bridgehead died of poisoning, remembered one participant in the defense. All the greenery in the fortress and in the surrounding area along the path of the gas cloud was destroyed. Leaves on the trees turned yellow, curled up, and fell off. The grass turned black and lay flat on the ground. Flower petals blew away. Every copper object on the fortress bridgehead, parts of guns, shells, wash basins, tanks, and so on, was covered with a thick green layer of chlorine oxide. Food supplies that weren't in hermetically sealed containers, meat, butter, lard, vegetables, were poisoned and became inedible. The German artillery then resumed its massive bombardment. Following the barrage and the gas cloud, 14 landward battalions, at least 7,000 infantrymen, advanced to storm the Russian forward positions. Their objective was to seize the strategically important Sosna position. They were told they would encounter nothing but corpses. Without gas masks, we suffered horrific injuries and chemical burns, wrote one defender. People choked, coughing up blood and foam from their lungs. Their hands and faces blistered. Rags tied around our faces did nothing. Yet Russian artillery opened fire, hurling shell after shell from within the green chlorine cloud at the Prussians. At that moment, the head of Osovets' 2nd Defense Sector, Svechnikov, shaken by violent coughing, rasped, "Friends, are we going to die like those Prussian cockroaches that got poisoned? Let's show them something they'll never forget," remembered Osovets defender Alexei Lepshkin. And so the survivors of that terrifying gas attack, among them the 13th Company, which had lost half its men, rose up. They were led by 2nd Lieutenant Vladimir Karpovich Kotlinsky. They advanced toward the Germans with their faces covered in tattered cloth. They had no strength to shout, "Hurrah!" They were racked by coughing, many coughing up blood and pieces of their lungs. But they kept going. One eyewitness told the newspaper Ruskoye Slovo, "I can't describe the fury and rage with which our soldiers charged the German poisoners. Heavy rifle and machine gun fire, thick bursts of shrapnel, none of it could halt the onslaught of our enraged troops. Exhausted and poisoned, they attacked with the sole goal of crushing the Germans. No one fell behind, and there was no need to urge them forward. There were no individual heroes here. Each company moved as one, driven by a single aim, a single thought, to perish if need be, but to avenge themselves on those vile poisoners." The 226th Zemlyansky Regiment's Combat Journal reports, "When they got within about 400 paces of the enemy, 2nd Lieutenant Kotlinsky, leading his company, rushed into a bayonet attack. He drove the Germans from their positions, forcing them into chaotic retreat. Without pausing, the 13th Company pursued the fleeing enemy. They used their bayonets to drive them from the trenches of the 1st and 2nd Sosna positions. Once again, they held the line, reclaiming our anti-assault gun and machine guns that the enemy had seized. At the end of this bold assault, 2nd Lieutenant Kotlinsky was mortally wounded. He handed over command of the 13th Company to 2nd Lieutenant Vladislav Strizaminsky of the 2nd Osovets Engineer Company, who brought the endeavor Kotlinsky had so bravely begun to a triumphant conclusion. Kotlinsky died that evening. By highest decree on September 26, 1916, he was posthumously awarded the Order of St. George, 4th class. The Sosna position was retaken, and the front line was restored. The success came at a heavy price. 660 men were lost. The events of August 6, 1915, marked the last heroic chapter in the defense of Osovets Fortress. The overall situation at the front was such that continuing to hold the fortress no longer made sense. A few days later, the General Staff ordered the garrison to cease fighting and begin evacuation. The withdrawal was completed on August 22nd. Any surviving fortifications and all property that could not be removed were destroyed by Russian sappers. On August 25th, the ruins of the fortress were occupied by German troops. That's all we have for now. If you enjoyed this video, please support us with a like and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.